We just heard the charges, wanton endangerment. Now, Dan, some people were demanding murder charges. They were demanding manslaughter charges. Explain exactly what is wanton endangerment for this one officer, Brett Hankison.
Right. Well, let's first take a step back for a moment. There's a dispute about whether the door was knocked on or not. The police said they did knock on the door. Kenneth Walker saying it didn't happen. And let's also start from the perspective to make it clear, Breonna was an innocent here. There is no allegation that she did anything wrong. So the question then becomes, as a legal matter, what is the responsibility of the officers? And you can see from the charge here, which is wanton endangerment, which is not reckless homicide. And the reason I'm comparing it to reckless homicide is because in both cases, you're basically talking about the same legal standard, which is that someone fired recklessly, wantonly, and in the case of homicide, the victim would have been Breonna Taylor. Here, the grand jury is saying the victims that we're charging for are the neighbors. Why? Because it seems that the grand jury believed that regardless of whether this was a good warrant and whether it was a warrant that should have been executed, they had a legal right to be there. And when they were fired upon, they responded. That doesn't mean that that's the answer that it should be, but that is the legal explanation for why there is no charge here with regard to homicide, because it seems clear the grand jurors did not believe that they acted beyond the scope of the warrant, except for Hankison firing that weapon. And he was already fired for that, using the exact same language, wantonly firing that weapon.
But Dan, explaining here, because people are going to say Breonna Taylor, as you mentioned, was just asleep in her apartment. She was with her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, who had a license to carry a gun, according to his attorney. We also know that according to the no-knock warrant, the postal inspector has said, because this all tied into an ex-boyfriend that Breonna Taylor had, police were alleging that apartment where she was staying at was allegedly receiving drug shipments. That's all in the no-knock warrant, but according to the postal inspector, they didn't know about this, and they had never signed off on this, or according to the postal inspector, spoke to the Louisville Metro Police Department about this issue. So if there are questions surrounding the actual warrant, we get to the point where Breonna Taylor is shot and killed, people are going to wonder here, how are the only victims in this case the neighbors?
Right, and I think that we need to separate out wrong from criminal. And again, I'm just explaining what the grand jury did here without making judgment on what they did. They clearly believed that it didn't rise to the level of being criminal because they had that legal document, that warrant, which allowed them to be in the house, to arrive at the house. Again, debate about whether they knocked or didn't knock, but no question they had this warrant. Now, looking back at whether that warrant should have been issued at all is a very important question, but that's a separate one from the officers who are now at the house with a legal warrant, and what did they do and when did they do it?
One of the officers, Sergeant John Mattingly, was shot in this incident as well. We do want to mention that. Dan, do we know if the grand jury's work is done? Do we think this is the end of this case right here?
I've got to believe that it is. I mean, I've got to believe that this is the indictment, because what a grand jury does not do is make announcements about who they're not indicting. We've seen this in the news a lot lately with James Comey and others who've gotten into trouble for speaking too much about people who were not indicted. So typically when someone isn't indicted, you simply don't discuss it, and the grand jury announces who they are indicting, which makes me think that what happened here is the grand jury evaluated evidence against all three officers, but in the end, or all four, and in the end decided just to hand up indictments with regard to one.
Dan, you're a legal expert. You've done probably thousands of these cases. From what you read about this case, from knowing this case, and seeing the charges and seeing whatever evidence has been available to the public so far, were you surprised by the charges brought?
Well, look, I expected at least this charge. right? At least this charge, and I'm looking down to make sure that we get the exact correct language for the definition, but this wanton endangerment in the first degree charge. Why did I expect that? Because the police department had already fired him for firing wantonly his weapon. So I think that was kind of the base here. The question of whether there would be additional charges, I didn't know what the grand jury was going to do. Look, I know how maddening this must be to people out there who are saying, what about Breonna? What about her? Why doesn't she get justice here? And sometimes the legal system, doesn't work in that kind of linear way, and where the criminal law can necessarily provide justice. We have seen in a civil lawsuit brought by her family that her family has gotten a big settlement, but most importantly, major changes in the police department as a result of that settlement. So when the question is, should there have been criminal charges, it gets tricky when the police have the legal right to have been there, even if it was a bad warrant, but if they have the legal right to be there, they're then fired upon. It is tough sometimes to get an indictment with that sort of fact pattern. But again, I want to reiterate, that doesn't change the reality that Breonna was the innocent victim here, whether it's in that indictment or not.